What did they find? That MPS, muscle protein synthesis, was highest with the 100-gram protein intake. And no, the body just didn't burn off the extra protein. It actually, they use these tracer studies where they can see where their amino acids go. And they found that more of the amino acids ended up in the actual muscle at the 100-gram of protein intake, which is exactly what people want, right? They want that protein to be going towards their muscle. And by measuring for 12 hours, they were able to see that this effect continued. It didn't just sort of drop off at 4 hours and ended up not being the result that we wanted. And so, hey, maybe the body has a greater capacity than previously assumed.
Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project Podcast. My name is Patrick Cummings. As always, I'm here with E.C. Sinkowski. Every week on the show, we aim to simplify the science of nutrition, health, and fitness, cutting through the noise to focus on the principles and practices that will help you perform better, feel better, and live better. Thank you so much for tuning into the show this week. Hi, E.C.
Hey, how are you?
I'm fantastic. You're rocking the street parking sweatshirt.
That's right. This thing
repping street parking
might be my new uniform. I do happen to love this hoodie.
All right. Well, I'm excited to get into this conversation with you this week. We are exploring the intricacies of protein intake, particularly its impact on muscle protein synthesis, something we've talked about before. We're going to dive into new research suggesting our bodies might have a greater capacity to absorb and utilize protein than previously thought, challenging long-held beliefs about protein distribution throughout the day. Before we get into it, a quick note on something that you folks out there might be interested in, the 3 Pillars Method Masterclass. We've talked about it before. If you are ready to finally ditch the diet confusion, perhaps it is time you jumped into the 3 Pillars Method Masterclass. What is it? It's a 10-week nutrition masterclass that EC has been perfecting for years, designed to help you cut through the nutritional noise and get right to the heart of what it takes to eat well sustainably. As a listener to the Consistency Project, you understand the principles, but now it's time to turn those principles into practice, all under EC's tutelage. Go to optimizemenutrition.com/masterclass to jump straight in. The link is also in the show notes. I promise you, you will not regret it. All right, you ready for this, EC? We're going to talk about, we were laughing before, this is the macronutrient we can't stop talking about.
Oh my God, protein.
So what are we talking about this week, and why are we back to, again, I said it right at the top, we have had an episode on muscle protein synthesis. We're back at it. Why?
Back at it.
Give us a little bit of context as to why we're kind of, I wouldn't say revisited, but bringing this back to the surface.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we talk about some topics more than once for a lot of different things, but I don't know. Yeah. For some reason, to me, it's always like protein. We still have questions about protein. We're still going to do it.
Yeah, we got a lot of CrossFitters. We got a lot of people trying to put more weight up over their head. So, that makes sense.
It's like the most popular nutrient to talk about. But so one of the common questions with protein is, does it matter when I eat? And what time of day does it matter? Of course, specific to protein. And I always bring my answer back to my principle 3, that timing only matters to the extent that it affects quantity, meaning it really doesn't matter when you eat your protein, so long as you eat enough across the day. And so if you don't have your protein shake right after a workout, that's fine. It does happen that that's typically a convenient time during the day to get in 20 to 30 grams of protein. So in many cases, if people don't utilize that time, they might end up not getting enough protein in the day simply because they missed out on that time of day. But it's not because it was those 30 minutes after the workout that mattered, that you could have that shake anywhere and have the same effect. And so we do have some old podcasts on protein digestion and absorption and muscle protein synthesis, where we kind of really go through a lot of the evidence there. But this is definitely one of the things that people kind of perennially hear, that it's most optimal for muscle growth if you spread your protein out throughout the day. And I do agree that it, keywords here, could be theoretically optimal to do that.
Could be theoretically.
Possibly
maybe is what I just heard.
Possibly maybe. Yes, for optimal muscle growth, that could be the case. But we don't have a ton of evidence that's definitively true. I think that's kind of how the descriptors gave it away already. And so I just have a really hard time giving people all these rules to follow if we don't know you have to do that. Maybe if you have everything already dialed in terms of your training and your diet, okay, maybe let's start worrying about theoretically optimal. But for a lot of times, I don't like to worry about it. So anyway, that's sort of a little bit of the backdrop. But lo and behold, at the end of last year in December, there's this new study that came out that suggests this perfect protein distribution throughout the day might not actually be optimal. And so I figured it's a good time to kind of revisit the topic, what we know about it, and then, of course, these new findings.
Awesome. So where does it make sense to jump in? What kind of background do we need to have to understand the claims that this study is relevant to or speaking to?
Yeah. There's kind of a couple different topics in the mainstream media that really circle around the notion about the magic of about 30 grams of protein at a time. You often hear that as a common serving size. And so one of the first claims that we hear about is that we can only absorb about 30 grams of protein at a time. And this is incorrect. And we went through that in a really detailed answer in this old protein digestion podcast. But basically, your body will absorb what you eat. For completeness, there is a little bit of lack of 100% effectiveness, maybe based on the food structure. Maybe you have a plant protein source that has a lot of fiber. Maybe you don't chew your food that well. So some of that will influence how much gets perfectly digested and freed away, if you will, from the food source. But in the sense of our capacity for our small intestine to absorb what is there, we definitely do have it. We don't find that there's a lot of protein in your waste, for example. I mean, the small intestine is huge. It's 22 feet long. We were designed to have this huge surface area such that we could absorb the necessary nutrients because that was so key to our survival. So that whole idea of, you can only eat a certain much at a certain period of time, definitely not accurate. Now, the second notion around this magic of 30 grams of protein at a time is sometimes you'll hear something like, 20 to 25 grams is how we maximize muscle protein synthesis, or MPS. And so the deal is all of our body's proteins are constantly being recycled. They're being degraded and rebuilt throughout the day. And this includes your muscles. And so we have this process of the rebuilding, muscle protein synthesis, or MPS. On the flip side, we also have muscle protein breakdown. That's the degrading part, or MPB. And it's just going on continuously. And it's really the balance between the two that will determine your net amount of muscle that you actually retain and have on your body. So to gain muscle, which everybody wants, of course, we do need to have muscle protein synthesis, but we do need to have more synthesis than breakdown. And so MPS is a good thing. We need to be worried or thinking about, okay, well, how do I promote MPS? Okay, resistance training, exercise is going to help kind of stimulate that. That's a stimuli that's going to damage the muscle and therefore will trigger the body. Okay, I need to go ahead and rebuild this muscle tissue. But then, of course, eating protein is going to help MPS because now the body has all of the nutrients around to put the muscle tissue together. And so there have been studies that look at, okay, well, how do we maximize this MPS thing? And they find that this number 25 grams after a resistance training effort has maximized muscle protein synthesis, and any more than that level of protein, the synthesis has sort of stayed the same or leveled off. And so sometimes you'll even hear, oh gosh, if you eat more than this 25 grams of protein, you're just wasting it. And so this is where we get these recommendations that it's really most optimal if you're looking to maximize muscle growth, that you have to have these protein intakes in these kind of like perfectly distributed 30-ish grams, somewhere in that neighborhood throughout the day.
Got it. Okay. So I know we want to dive into the study itself, but first, we also have talked plenty about the need to understand the nuances inside of studies like this, inside of research like this. So can we talk about some of those nuances enough to understand this particular research?
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the things that's really important to understand about research is it only really tells you what they studied, which I know you're going to be like, okay, that's really an obvious comment. You see, like, okay. Like, what I mean by that, though, is if they measured something for 4 hours, all we can say we know is what happens for 4 hours. We can't say what happens for 12 hours. We can't say what happens at 2 days. If they test subjects with 30 grams of protein and they give them 25 or 30 grams of protein after resistance training, all we know is what happens with those 25 or 30 grams of protein. We don't know what happens with 50 grams of protein. We don't know what happens with 100 grams of protein. If they tested muscle protein synthesis, all we know is what's happening with MPS. We don't know what's happening with MPB, the breakdown, or more importantly, we don't necessarily know what's happening to their net change of muscle mass on their body. If they tested recreational male lifters, all we know is that this applies to recreational male lifters, not necessarily beginners, not necessarily advanced athletes, not necessarily females. I like going through all of those things because I think a lot of that context gets lost. You'll hear these things repeated all the time. Oh, 30 grams of protein or 25 grams of protein maximizes MPS. And that's sort of the tip or the takeaway that people have. But it's like, okay, well, did that study really address who you are? And did that study really address all possible conditions? And I find that that happens all the time is when people are kind of translating the research, is they're willing to extrapolate beyond what was actually tested to be able to draw a conclusion. I think it's also important to realize that we don't have that much research, especially once you consider all of those different factors, to think about, okay, did they really go through all of the different possible protein intakes? Not just 25 grams, but they look at 0 grams and 10 grams and 15 grams and 35 grams and all the way up the scale. Did they really look at your level of athleticism? Did we have a lot on males and females? That, if you're really going to want some of these definitive answers, the research just isn't there, because that just takes a long time and a lot of different studies to do. And so I just have to kind of put all of that backdrop in there, because I think, again, there can be some studies that show one or two things, and we're very quick to then say, okay, that's the answer and we know what happens. When in reality, we are probably thinking that we see the world or see the universe when we only are limited to what exactly the study looked at.
Got it. Okay. So I mentioned this kind of at the top. This new study kind of goes against the grain of what some of the accepted norms are. Can we start to dive into the research itself, maybe a little bit of the background of the existing research and conclusions before we get into this specific study, the reason we're talking today?
Yeah, so there is a good amount of research just on muscle protein synthesis, but I wanted to look at those specifically after resistance training, in part because that's what this new paper looked at. And I think we can get some collective agreement that if you want to maximize muscle mass, we're going to need to have some resistance training. So let's look at the studies where, okay, protein is in the general ballpark of what I recommend, and that people are also doing resistance training. And so for research studies in that group, we have about 4 that I can find, like the original research that would include this new study. And so they're all going to be in the show notes, but there's a paper by Moore in 2009. They looked at 6 males. Yes, you heard me right. Very small study, 6 males. These individuals had at least 4 months to 8 years of resistance training. So that's a pretty wide range of experience. Their diet included protein close to the 0.7 grams per pound that I recommend. And what they had them do is a leg resistance exercise session. And then after that session, they were given 0, 5, 10, 20, or 40 grams of whole egg protein immediately after. And then they measured MPS for 4 hours. And lo and behold, MPS was maximized at that 20 gram intake, not at 40 gram intake. And so this is one of the studies where it's like, oh, okay, the 20 grams is the more optimal. Following up to that, we have a Woodard study in 2014, 48 young men. They had about 6 months of recreational training. Their usual diet had them about 1 gram per pound of body weight. And again, after a leg resistance exercise session, they were given 0, 10, 20, or 40 grams of whey protein, a little bit different. And then they measured MPS for 4 hours. And they also found that MPS was maximized at 20 grams of protein intake, not 40. So those 2 studies, it's really easy to step back. Like, let's put this in the wider context, to step back and be like, oh, wow, okay, 2 different studies. We're finding that this 20 grams is the magic number. And yeah, I don't want to take anything against these studies. They are, quote, good studies. And I understand research is hard to do, but they're still missing a lot. I mean, first of all, the sample size between them is 54 people. I mean, you're never going to want to make a big health decision based on what happened to 50 people and 50 people only. It's really small. Next, they were both only looking at leg resistance training. So leg press, leg extension, which is fine. But does that mean that we can say the same for back squats or cleans? No. Does it mean that we can say we know what's going to happen when somebody does a full body session? No, because we'd actually have to measure it. And then finally, they don't actually measure muscle mass. We just look at what happens to synthesis rates for 4 hours. And so I think, we want to keep always thinking of, is this actually measuring what I care about? And a lot of people care about muscle mass. And in this case, they actually didn't measure it. So this would be a case where somebody could say, studies show 20 grams of protein maximizes muscle protein synthesis, and they are correct, but it's also leaving out all of those other things that I just mentioned. Okay, so anyway, moving on, we have a McNaughton study in 2016. They had 30 male weightlifters. They had been doing at least 2 lifting sessions for the past 6 months, so not true beginners. Their usual diets had them close to 0.9 grams per pound of protein. They did a full body exercise session. So this is different than the prior two. We had some upper body and lower body isolation machines. They were given either 20 or 40 grams of whey protein. And again, MPS was measured for 5 hours. And guess what? We found that in this case, the 40-gram intake maximized MPS, not the 20.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think it's because we had them use whole body versus just looking at the legs. And so there's this stimulus or this demand on the body of you have to use more muscle right now during the exercise session. So guess what? We're going to need to rebuild more muscle afterwards. And so I'm guessing that's why there was a higher maximal rate of MPS, simply because more muscles were used in the session. That would be my kind of guess of why that happened. But I would want to point out, even from this study, it's still limited. We don't know that 40 grams is where it was truly optimized. Yes, it was better than 20 grams in comparison to the other studies. But what about 60 grams? Would that have been better? And so, again, we can see how maybe a headline or somebody could walk away from this study and it's like, oh, okay, well, that means I need 40 grams of protein to optimize my MPS. But there's still lots of limitations. Have we truly optimized it? Is it really building more muscle mass? Is it really specific to the exercise that people are doing? So lots of things that are left off the table by way of the fact of exactly what they tested and just looking at that.
Okay. 15 minutes into this conversation, I think maybe now's the time to get into the new study. So this new study comes out. How is it the same, different? How does it contrast or agree with all of these things in terms of maximizing MPS?
Yeah, so this is the Tromelin paper in the show notes. 36 healthy, recreationally active young men. Notice we've only talked about men so far, so that's also another thing. Working out. A lot of times, I guess I should say, males are easier to study in part because we don't have to worry about the hormonal fluctuation and how that might be playing into the outcome. So it's one of the ways it's a little bit easier to study. But anyway, these guys are working out 2 to 3 times a week, so probably not advanced lifters, but also not just truly beginners. They're eating about 0.6 grams per pound of protein in their diet before this study begins, which is a little bit lower than I like, but okay, we're not super low yet. They do a full body exercise session, so they do upper body and lower body. And then with this study, they measured MPS after the workout for 12 hours, which is nice. We're extending past that 4 to 5 hours where we've been before. And what they did is they gave the individuals either 0 grams of protein, 25 grams of protein, which of course was the magic number in a couple of the studies or close to it, or they gave them 100 grams of protein.
Sure.
And they measured, okay, what happens to MPS? And then how much of that protein was really absorbed in the muscle, or was it just wasted, as some people had thought if you eat too much, it might just be wasted and used for energy or burned off. What did they find? That MPS, the muscle protein synthesis, was highest with the 100-gram protein intake. And no, the body just didn't burn off the extra protein. They use these tracer studies where they can see where their amino acids go. And they found that more of the amino acids ended up in the actual muscle at the 100-gram of protein intake, which is exactly what people want, right? They want that protein to be going towards their muscle. And by measuring for 12 hours, they were able to see that this effect continued. It didn't just sort of drop off at 4 hours and ended up not being the result that we wanted. And so exactly what kind of you said in the beginning, the conclusions of the authors are that, hey, maybe the body has a greater capacity than previously assumed. And the takeaway for the individual should be that, okay, maybe I don't need to perfectly space my protein out by every 4 hours, or I don't need it to be only in 25 gram increments or something like that. And I mean, I just love this study. Of course, it has its own weaknesses, similar to the other ones that we discussed. Even though that they found this high rate of MPS at the 100-gram intake, we still don't necessarily know it transferred to bigger biceps. We still didn't measure their actual muscle mass. We still didn't actually measure their performance, right? It's still small. It's only 36 people. Yes, it's only men. It's not with advanced lifters. So there's all these other limitations of whether or not this is really going to be relevant to each individual person. But I like it because I think that we can start to make some better recommendations versus what we had prior, which was just, focus on this perfect protein distribution. And so, again, I think that if you were to look at the prior studies, coming to the conclusion that has been perpetuated out there of 25-ish, 30-ish grams of protein is most optimal. Yes, that is right in light of what the data was there, but we also have to catch ourselves and think, am I just limited to what was tested? And I have to be
Mm-hmm.
aware of what are all of the other potential options out there that could be more optimal that I'm just not saying or recommending only because the research didn't test it. And here we find that, oh my gosh, is 100 grams of protein at a time more optimal?
Mm. So does this given all that, does this change or alter your recommendations on protein, intake or timing or distribution? Or is this just another, kind of to your point, like another data point? Now we can have a slightly more nuanced conversation about this.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's more of just a data point, in part because for me, I always want to know, okay, well, if the goal is muscle mass, let's look at the studies that measure muscle mass.
Mm-hmm.
Let's actually see how this plays out with the goal that we want. And admittedly, there aren't a ton, but when we do look at where does muscle mass or performance actually change, it changes based on total protein intake, not when they had it. Now, does more work need to be done? Of course, yes, we can always do more studies and better populations and men, women, and bigger, and all of the stuff and the limitations that I addressed. But where we have evidence relative to muscle mass, we find that it's more dictated based on total protein intake, not necessarily when you had it. And so I'm going to keep kind of steering people that way. Now, for people that truly want to optimize muscle mass gain, first I'm going to look for some basic consistency around a high enough level of protein. That should sound familiar. I'm going to look for some consistency around training. I'm going to look for consistency around sleep, all of that stuff. And then I would try to optimize their total protein intake, i.e. is 0.9 for better than 0.7 for you? Do you want to be closer to 1 gram per pound? Look at optimizing the total amount that they're taking in any single day before trying to mess around with, okay, well, what's our spacing throughout the day? And so I don't really think this changes anything at all for me, but I like to rehammer. That's the approach for optimization that I would suggest for individuals versus thinking about timing. That is so far down the line. To me, when would I worry about timing? Truly, truly professional athlete who has done everything else and has already achieved a really high level of success, and there's nothing else to do.
That leads to just, I think, the one question I've got, just thinking about these kinds of studies, right, with MPS and all the others, is the point, like when researchers go in to do that kind of science, is it in the back of their minds, are they thinking about like, oh, if we can figure this out, everybody gets a lot healthier? Or is it, oh, if we can figure this out, that the 1% can get, slightly fitter, slightly, perform a little bit? I think maybe like, you always do an awesome job of this, and you just did that right at the end of actually bringing it back to like you in your kitchen. And I think that's really important. But I'm just curious, like this, like the MPS feels very far away from my kitchen. Right. And so I'm just curious, like, is it just science for science sake? Like what is ultimately the goal of doing these kinds of studies other than the obvious of like, oh, is it 20 grams? Is it 25 grams? Is it 100 grams?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for all scientists, of course. I know you know that. But I do think that scientists who are truly doing the research understand the complexity of what they're looking at and the daunting amount of work and effort to prove what they want to prove. And they are more than willing and happy to be one of the additional data points that puts the puzzle together. Like they know the puzzle is 10,000 pieces and they've added one piece.
Got it.
It's the headlines, which I think we're going to talk about soon on another podcast.
Yeah, good tease. Yeah,
right. That make us like I don't think these scientists they finish, and I mean that's why the end of every study is, well, more research needs to be done. They know that they didn't prove anything. They know that by selecting 0 grams or 100 grams that they've locked themselves into those two choices. But they're also bound by their resources, time, availability, all of these other things. So I think most scientists, they're really in it to understand the system better. And they know that they're just one piece to the overall puzzle. They're not saying that we've solved the answer. And they realize that the answer is maybe even beyond their lifetime and their research time.
I think it's a great point. Really cool. Thank you. And good tease for a future episode in a couple of weeks. We've got a headlines versus realities episode coming. So folks, stay tuned for that. One more reminder, if you want to check out the 3 Pillars Method Masterclass, go to optimizemenutrition.com/masterclass. You can jump in. And if you are a coach and you would like to become an affiliate of the 3 Pillars Method Masterclass, head to the website, optimizemenutrition.com. Learn all about how you can do that with your clients. Thank you, EC. Thank you, everybody out there, for listening. Thank you for your ratings and your reviews. EC and I'll be back next week for another episode of the Consistency Project podcast.